Hello and welcome to this second part of a three-part series about the connection between Jamaican music, punk and post-punk. I can't force you to watch the first part first, but I'd advise you to. So around 1970, consciousness increased in what was now being called reggae music. What was happening was that the spiritual movement Rastafarianism was becoming more and more enmeshed with the musical community. Rastas held the rude boys of the island with the utmost contempt. Rude boys were often paid to disrupt sound systems with violence or just menaces. They stole, they damaged their communities. They drove Jamaicans apart. They were doing the work of Babylon. Gang violence was a big problem in Jamaica, and very often political parties were arming the actual militias themselves. It got worse through the 1970s. As the economy got worse, violence got worse as well. And all this kind of culminated in 1976 when 200 people died in the lead up to the Jamaican elections. The same marijuana that Rastafarians took as a sacrament was a product to the gangsters of Jamaica. There was a lot of money to be made on the export market, and especially to America. The government of Jamaica launched a war on drugs during the 70s in an attempt to appease the US government. It didn't work. The States was the biggest market for the herbal export, and sometimes the Americans paid in guns. As you can imagine, that didn't improve things at all. And so the lyrical themes of reggae become more and more about stopping the violence that was ripping the country apart. Of course, these ideals of peace, love and tolerance are not a million miles away from the hippie ideals. And in a way, reggae music acted as a substitute for the hippie identity for a lot of kids in the 1970s. The difference is that by the 1970s, the hippies had, in the eyes of the kids, sold out. The radical elements had given up fighting together in a haze of harder drugs and fractured politics. And as for the rich ones, the rock stars, they'd gotten soft. John Lennon sang about no possessions from his beautiful mansion playing a grand piano with a Rolls Royce outside the door. Normal people couldn't relate to that in any way. But that wasn't the same with the Rastafarian movement. It stayed united against oppression, Babylon. The struggle didn't end with getting a job in an insurance office like it did for so many hippies. Rastas couldn't rightly cut their hair off and go straight. Now there's an irony that the Rastas were so against the violence which was ripping their country apart, against the criminals, but they were treated like criminals themselves. It's difficult not to get arrested all the time if everyone knows that smoking illegal substances is part of your belief system. That's going to bring police attention. The Rasta population was persecuted by police. And that was not just in Jamaica. And it wasn't just confined to Rastas either. But it happened as a lot in the UK, where in the 1970s sus laws were established. These laws let police search on suspicion any individual who they suspected to be carrying anything they shouldn't be by law. It's fine in theory. However, it probably won't be any surprise to know that 1970s UK police officers tended to skew towards the racists. So these powers were used disproportionately towards young black males. It still happens today. The image of the Jamaican rebel was set in youth consciousness in a great part by the 1972 film The Harder They Come, which starred reggae singer Jimmy Cliff. It's the gritty tale of a young man new to the city who launches into two careers: musician and, in parallel, criminal. The second he gets kind of pulled into by poor luck and choices. Ivan, the main character, is a blend of hero, anti-hero and victim of a corrupt society. His decisions are often reckless, but he's a victim of police brutality, corruption and just bad luck. The film helped set the tone for the next era of reggae music. 1960s Jamaican music was, broadly speaking, up-tempo club records, 7-inch parties. Just as in the 1960s, in 1960s rock, the themes of songs, grew more socially conscious. Themes of anti-authoritarianism and that kind of thing came more and more into reggae music. Reggae music became a calling card for the rebel, someone who wanted to fight the man, Babylon. Now let's move on to Bob Marley a bit. Bob Marley is the third world's first superstar, and it's probably no coincidence and shows a lot of the racism of the time that he himself was mixed race. He was probably a lot more accepted by Jamaican society as well as Europe and America. A lot more accepted than if he'd have had the skin tone of, say, Peter Tosh. That's how the world was, and unfortunately still is to an extent, and that kind of brings us to the thorny topic of cultural appropriation, now which isn't a new thing at all. There was a thankfully brief fashion for reggae pastiche from white artists. There's tracks like, famous ones like 10cc's Dreadlock Holiday. There's the reggae part of Live and Let Die. The original title of Hotel California by the Eagles was Mexican Reggae. And Eric Clapton famously covered Marley's I Shot the Sheriff, making it a worldwide hit. Looking back, it's kind of odd, given this is around the same time that Clapton launched into his infamous racist onstage tirade. But in any case, Bob Marley got a hand up into the mainstream from Eric Clapton, a man who made his whole career from very precisely copying the work of black artists like Freddie King and Albert King. Now, social consciousness though, although there were ska hits like Young, Gifted and Black, which were very sort of socially conscious, they were very much so on a local level. There was Dandy Livingstone's Rudy, A Message for You, very, very famous, of course, which talked about politics as in violence on a local level and trying to discourage that violence. But all that kind of started to change. The consciousness became more global. Reggae music moved on to condemn the government, much in the same way that the punks would a few years later. Junior Biles' Beat Down Babylon's an example of this. Oh, what a wicked situation, I and I starving, this might cause a revolution and a dangerous pollution. So through reggae songs, singers were denouncing the government and Babylon, which is basically anything that keeps people down. Babylon could be not getting a job because you have the wrong postal code. It could be police oppression. It could be an exploitative record contract. And apart from peace and unity, the main aim of the Rastafarian movement is to bring down Babylon. And kind of the profile of Rastafarianism and Marley were intertwined in the mid-70s. Marley got more famous from 1975 through to 1977 when he released what I think is his best album, Exodus, in the summer of punk. Young punks knew that they needed to hide their Genesis or even Gentle Giant records, but reggae was permitted. It was the sound of the underdog. As much as Anarchy in the UK or Rumours, for me, Exodus is what I think of as being kind of the sound of that era in Britain. And there are a lot of people who are into reggae. Ian Curtis is an example. His love of the genre goes back way before the punk explosion. Around 1975, he worked for a year in Rare Records in Manchester. It seems he was kind of like the only approachable member of staff, and he was very enthusiastic about the records coming out of Jamaica. His wife Deborah says this in Touching From a Distance. Ian always had an interest in reggae music. Bob Marley and Toots and the Maytals already figured in his diverse record collection. Moving into that area of Manchester gave Ian the opportunity to throw himself into the local culture. So the couple went to club nights in the area. They wouldn't be the only white faces there, but probably the only white married teen couple. As individuals, though, their experiences weren't unique. All over Britain, young people were becoming immersed in the culture of Jamaica. For over a decade now, there have been something called blues parties. Now, these have nothing to do with the blues music of Eric Clapton and Robert Johnson and all that business. No, these are basically house parties which kind of carry on in the sound system tradition in Afro-Caribbean areas of Britain's big cities. There was an entry fee charged, but the main money was made selling drinks, and yes, you could probably find something to smoke as well. Manchester had these parties, Moss Side with its big Jamaican population. So did Leeds, Birmingham, lots of different parts of London. So as long as young white kids didn't go looking for trouble and they were respectful, there'd be no problems. But the police didn't quite see the value in all this community building, and they frequently raided them. So going to a blues would have an edge to it. It's straight away anti-establishment. There'd always be the chance of ending up in the back of a van. A reggae influence bled into the first fumblings of many a post-punk musician. One example is Paul Simonon of The Clash, who learnt to play along with reggae albums. The grooves are economical, they teach you the meaning of space. Now, I have to admit, I'm not the biggest Clash fan in the world, but they definitely did have a lot of great moments. And Guns of Brixton is one of those. That bass line comes straight from roots reggae. It's 100% Kingston. It was normal as well to play reggae records before punk gigs. Don Letts is a big player on all this. After all, there were very few actual punk records to play at those first gigs. Should it be New Rose yet again? So the same kids who were going to punk gigs and forming bands were listening to reggae. On the radio, John Peel had been playing so much reggae, he picked up the nickname Jar Peel. And the Clash, of course, covered Junior Mervin's Police and Thieves on their first album. The original of that was recorded by Lee Perry, of course, who will be coming back to later. The Ruts, growing up in London, gave a pretty good approximation of reggae on Jah War. Bands like this are mainly influenced by the reggae sort of timing feel. There's the Police, of course, who didn't take anything avant-garde and merely produced admittedly well-written pop songs in a reggae style. If we're talking about cultural appropriation, I think there's a special place for the Police in there. So just as Wings and the Eagles had appropriated the rhythmic feel, that's what the Police were now doing. Anyway, rant over. What happened in post-punk was, a couple of years later, was an approach to oral spaces, and the construction of the music became kind of integral to both the writing and the production. We're going to move on to that in the third part of the episode, but listen now. So, a lot of this comes down to choice of substance. Punk is, of course, pure speed music. It's spiky, it's aggressive, it's fast. Reggae is kind of the opposite. It's connected with ganja. And there's a legend that punks didn't smoke ganja because it doesn't really fit in with their image. But that's not really true. Sound systems, blues parties were probably the best place to buy it in the late 1970s if you didn't want to hang around with hippies as well. Don Letts remembers it like this. We used to make joints before we went to work to sell to the punks over the counter. The people would come in and say, give me 2 beers and a spliff. No, make that 2 spliffs and a beer. They couldn't make Jamaican cones. So, just as with punk, the music and the drugs went hand in hand. Marley's popularity kind of opened the doors for more avant-garde artists as well. Bob Marley's songs are based on good songcraft, melody, and of course, the Jamaican rhythmic feel. He developed that feel in the earlier part of his career working with the great Lee Perry. And that's where we're going to leave it for this episode. Thanks for watching again. See you in the next one, where we'll be talking about more of the abstract elements of in particular dub reggae and post-punk, and we'll be wrapping things up. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like and all that business. Sharing is caring. See you later. Bye.